the pop-up bookshop, My Offset World, at the Callicoon Gallery, which unfortunately has since closed. But I remember very vividly sitting with her in this purpose-built sort of little chair, table, stool, sitting across from her with a few other people who were in the gallery, and chatting about all of the works that surrounded us, and thinking deeply about her work and her approach to her very particular approach via the book form and via the museum form, the portable museum form, especially in her work. And it was such a rich way of talking with her because we were surrounded by the work. So we could almost sort of pick up the work and think with it as we were chatting. So that's sort of the mode I want to introduce her to you today. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with her work. And I find that each of us has our own Dayanita Singh, our sort of vision of how we encounter her work. So I'm sort of sharing with you mine today. So Dayanita's work folds in on itself. That is one of the things that you'll find as you look again and again at her work, is that you'll recognize the same picture, or even the same person, maybe a little bit older. You'll see the same images coming back in completely different forms, completely different settings. And it's actually one of the joys of her work, is to kind of rediscover an absolutely stunning photograph in a completely different setting, and be able to think about it in dialogue with a different set of images, a different tactile experience of holding a book or looking at a photograph in a constructed setting. So because of that, I find that it's actually very difficult to tell a chronological narrative of her body of work, of her biography. And I find that that's actually kind of counter to the way in which I feel like her work operates. So what I want to do is just almost tour you around this gallery where she and I sat together years ago. So the first thing I want to show you are these beautifully wrapped cloth packages here on this table in the front of the image at the right. And here they are in close-up. And these are called poetic. And what they are is there are these custom-made teak boxes inside. But I just want you to ponder the wrapping for a second, because there's a sort of tension between really a desire to keep it wrapped, to keep it safe, to keep it enclosed, and the desire to unwrap. And so this is the poetic box that we actually have at Hopkins in our special collections. And these are my own photographs of being in special collections, and the stress of unwrapping it. Someone else had unwrapped it earlier than I had, but to unwrap it again and then to sort of have it out on the table in front of me, the sort of tactile, engaged, sort of rich experience of that was quite astounding, actually. So you can see the different layers of the object as it unfolds. And then inside the teak box are these cards. There are 30 of them, and each one has a different photograph of a storeroom, a file room. And this project Dayanita has been taking photographs of since the first decade of this century, and really started to put it into motion, put it into objects, and put it on display in various contexts, into books in 2010, in the second decade of this century. And so I sort of call this whole project the File Room Project, and it goes under different names. So what you're looking at here are 3 poetic boxes, and you can see that the 30 images, as if you own one of these, if you have one of these in your hand, you can change the image, right? Maybe you change it every day, or you can change it, you can go through them, you can spread them out on a table, or you can have multiple poetic boxes and put them side by side. And this is actually one of the beautiful things about Dayanita's work, is its malleability and its invitation to us to engage with it, to curate it, if you will, to think with it in various different ways, to have it inhabit our world directly. So in addition to the poti boxes in this room, she also produced these beautiful small boxes. And here you see on the right, you see a single box that's been sort of opened. So you can see inside each box of this Museum Bhavan box. And there are multiple, she's done this format in different contexts. So there are different named boxes. But Museum Bhavan has a series of booklets inside, each one named differently, as you can see on the spines. But also she's produced these suitcases, these rolling suitcases, so you could have a whole set of Museum Bhavans that she can then sort of bring, almost like a salesperson, she can bring them around to do different little pop-up sales events. And each booklet, when you open it, it is an accordion booklet. And you can see on the far wall of the Callicoon Gallery there in the main image, you can see the accordion booklets displayed on shelves. This is actually not Museum Bhavan. This is Sent a Letter, a different booklet, box of booklets. But these are just beautifully crafted and very intimate. They're fairly small, so they really fit in your hand. And so this is the opening page of one of the booklets in that Museum Bhavan. This is the Book of Machines. And this is actually one of my favorite images because I feel like the little lunch boxes are having a little conversation, like they're having lunch together. So this is the kind of intimacy that these booklets tend to evoke. And then this is another spread, right? So this is 2 pages that are open from one of these accordion booklets from the Little Museum of Printing Presses. And then here, you can also unfold them to be more than just 2 if you want. So these are sort of 4 spreads from a variety of different booklets that are all in Museum Bhavan. So just to give you a taste of the kinds of variability, malleability, engagement, intimacy of this project. And File Room continues. This is actually the book called File Room. So this is a double page spread of actually a much larger single book. It's not very thick, but it's a large format book. And here you get uncaptioned images of storerooms. And we'll come back and talk, I think, about some of these when we turn to Dayanita. But this is actually one of my favorite spreads because I love the idea of the bicycle in the storeroom, indicating that someone's there, there's a human there that has biked into work. And so it's not just sort of files sitting on shelves or wrapped in cloth. So this project, this is another spread from that same book. So we do see people in these spaces. We do see the kind of wall of material, of paper, of cloth wrapped objects, of things in boxes, of things in almiras and in cabinets. And another spread, again, just to give you a sense. I find these spaces quite quiet, but then as you look at them more, they become a little bit louder and louder and louder. So we can also talk about that. And then File Room also takes form in various other contexts. So in addition to the smaller teak boxes that we saw with Poti Box, you have these amazing installations that are room-sized that again unfold. They feel very malleable, even as they are also massive, sort of larger than life constructions. So these again are portable museums that one can manipulate in various spaces and that can be adapted to different gallery and museum spaces. So we see on the left File Museum, and you can see that the images there are familiar in the sense that they would have also been, many of them, in the File Room book. On the right is Go Away Closer. This is a different project, but a similar kind of archivally directed, historically directed, bringing different images in from her oeuvre into these constructions. And one of the things that I wanted to emphasize in introducing her work is that these kinds of things that I'm pointing out to you with File Room go back. File Room itself is a decade and more project. And this is true of a lot of her work. So one of her earlier projects is this one called Privacy, where she spends time with families across India, in Calcutta, in Bombay, in Delhi, and she enables them to set up their portraits within their homes. So in some ways, this is akin for me to many of the things that we see later in File Room, because she's looking at the ways in which people understand space, just as we understand the space of the storeroom. And there's also a sense of history, of memory, of lives lived. And I feel like that's similar in the ways in which File Rooms evoke a kind of memory record of the human. So Privacy is one of her earlier works. Again, and she will go back to those families again and again. And then one of her earliest works is this one. This is the Zakir Hussain project from 1986, which she recently reissued in a maquette in 2019, where she's given us access to her own thinking and her own sort of mocking up of the original book, which was published in 1986. So this is a project where she is working with Zakir Hussain, the very famous musician. And this came out of, again, a longitudinal engagement with this artist. So spending time over decades with him and learning from him and sort of creating the work almost together. So I think this is, again, another characteristic of a lot of her working practice. And many of you will also be familiar with this project, myself, Mona Ahmed, published in 2001, but again, with photographs going back into the previous decade and continuing after this. And so this idea of a longitudinal engagement, intimate engagement with an individual, with a community, where there is a collaborative aspect to the project of putting these images together with text, in this case, into a book. Okay, so today I've titled this, and this is my title, I've titled this discussion Conversation Piece. And this is a conceit that is drawn from a photograph that I saw at this exhibition here in 2018 in London. This installation is called Poetic, and you can see many of the photographs on the towers that are in the room they're from this File Room project. They're interiors of File Rooms. And on one of the towers, I saw this photograph. And it struck me for a number of reasons, one of which is that you rarely see Dayanita herself in her photographs, but occasionally you will see her camera. And so this image struck me because you could see her camera, but also it signaled to me something that I believe Avik Sen, one of the writers that collaborates with her in some of her projects, that he said about her work, which is that it's very art historical as well, that you can, as an art historian, start to see references, aesthetic, compositional references in her work. And here I felt like there was a number of references I kept seeing, but one of them is that it felt like a conversation piece to me. And for those who don't know, the conversation piece is an 18th century genre of portraiture, practiced very vigorously in Britain. And so I just wanted to show you, because Dayanita also asked me to share this. So this is her photograph, and I'm putting it in dialogue with Johann Zafny's, one of Johann Zafny's many conversation pieces. This was sort of one of his métier. This is one of the ways in which he earned a living, is by painting these conversation pieces. And these are group portraits, usually family group portraits. So actually very akin, again, to Dayanita's Privacy project, where the family presents itself to the public, to its audience in its house, as a family and as a particular kind of family. So everything in the painting usually signals something about the wealth and status of the family. In this case, there's also a signal about the way in which these very forward-thinking parents are raising their children, not as automatons strapped into restrictive clothing, but as playful creatures who can do have a little bit of their own will in the way in which they move around. This is very forward-thinking for the time, for the mid-18th century. And then you can see signaled on the walls things like a painting of continental Europe, beautiful carvings around the fireplace surround, the silver service on the table, but all, arranged in a kind of dynamic pyramidal structure around the patriarch and the matriarch of the family. So this is what a conversation piece looks like. And what's interesting for those of you who are South Asianists in the room, you will know that Zoffany, the fashion for these died in sort of 1780. And so Zoffany ended up going to India, where he painted more conversation pieces in the 1780s. So some of you might be more familiar with conversation pieces like this one, which is of the Impey family, Elijah and Lady Impey. He was a member of the Supreme Court in Calcutta. And this puts a colonial spin, right, on the conversation piece. So we are still signaling status, but now we're doing so in the context of colonial hierarchies of power and colonial engagements with dressing and performing in certain ways. So this is the central figure here is the son dressed in local garb, dancing. There's musicians, there are servants behind Elijah Impey, and then there are ayahs taking care of one of the other sons of the family. And you can see Lady Impey sitting to the left with her son behind her as well. And here we're not in an interior, we're in an exterior. So there's also an emphasis on things like the vegetation of India on the right, for example. So these are the kinds of references that, and I wanted to just share again that Lady Impey herself was also a patron of the arts and created her own album, her own archive of botanical paintings painted by very highly respected Indian artists at the time. So you may also be familiar with her. So I wanted to, let's see, let me go back here. So I wanted to open up the floor to Dayanita by turning to this photograph, this conversation, what I'm calling a conversation piece, and asking her to reflect perhaps on what I've just set up in terms of these comparisons, but also the ways in which we might think about her file room project, her engagement with these storerooms, and what kinds of conversations we might start to evoke around them. So with that, I will, with your permission, Dayanita, turn it over to you. Oh. Are you there, Dayanita?
Dayanita, you're muted. Could you just put your microphone on?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I was saying thank you so much for this amazing conversation, introduction to conversation pieces, Rebecca. I had not seen these paintings before, and I can actually think, Rebecca, of another project with you that we could build up around conversation pieces, exactly what we have on the screen now. Because since 2000, 2001, I was actually quite obsessed with empty spaces. And so I would photograph chairs and beds with no people around, but of course there were people around, and the chairs gather the spirits of people who've used them, but the chairs also gather personalities and gender. So when I started to explore the file room, and I was trying to do it as a project where I wanted to really photograph these incredible archives, I couldn't resist when I would find a situation like this, you know. It's clear that two people were sitting there and having a conversation, probably drinking water from the ghada over there, and then there's a little water filter kind of thing on the right, and probably someone's food wrapped in some bundle somewhere among the archives. And even though I knew that this was not what I was looking at, and I had moved on from chairs, but the idea of conversations is so fundamental to my work. I even called a work ongoing conversation. I called one of my Museum Bhavan exhibitions conversation chambers. So conversation is very, very important to me, to my work, to my life, and it's all interconnected. So the image that you're seeing there is not something, if I thought I was really photographing it for the archive, I wouldn't have left my camera in there. But I just photographed it because it was exactly like those empty spaces that are never empty. And even though so much of my file room work appears as though nobody is there, I mean, none of this is possible without an incredible archivist who has the memory of, a giant computer, who knows where everything is. These are all the archives are photographed, are living archives. They're in use. So wonderful to start with the conversation piece, because I guess the idea of a setup of the conversation is equally important to me. So when I make my structures, it's also to see what is the distance we need between two people for a certain kind of conversation, and how should like the conversation we had at the Callicoon Gallery, you know, it's very carefully calibrated, the kind of gap there needs to be between two people, which is not too intrusive, but also leads to a certain kind of conversation. So wonderful that you call this conversations.
Yes, no, I think, and we had in our symposium in May, we had a series of wonderful presentations, and one of them was from Alison Hess, who is a former curator, now academic, who took her students to a storeroom at the at the London Transport Museum. And she made these amazing sketches as she was moving through. And it revealed how much an archive, which we think of as, and in many of I'll just see if I can go back. In this photograph, as you said, sort of signals how many people are there. But of course, in every archive, there must be some area where they can have some drink and sit around and chat. And this was true of the archive the storeroom that Hess showed us as well, that we have this wonderful dynamic space that's enlivened by one archivist or many archivists. And we can go back to, your photographs often have a human, right, in the corner here, or here, this beautiful photograph on the left where she's facing away from us, but she's kind of, a towering figure within this overwhelming enveloping of files. So I do think there is a kind of recognition of human presence throughout this body of work that reminds us constantly. And so, Dayanita, did you have I know that can you speak more to the inclusion of or how you craft the inclusion of bodies of humans, of these archivists in your practice, or is it more serendipitous, I suppose?
Well, everything in my life is serendipitous, I would say, and that's why I have a museum of chance. But the inclusion of people, there's an interesting story. When I started the File Room project, just the very, very early pictures, Orhan Pamuk came to my house in Goa, and he saw those little pictures, and I was off to Bogota, and he put his hands on my shoulder and he said, Bogota is not important. You have to go back to these archives and don't forget the little men and women. And somehow that stayed with me. And yet I didn't want to make a piece about the archivists because I was really obsessed with a certain visceral feeling that I had when I went into certain archives, not all archives. So I wanted to, of course, include the people, and the more I got involved, the larger the figures became. But most often there was just like a little hint of them. And the photograph that we have on the left, I actually often try to pass off as my family portrait. I used to have very long hair in those days. And so that could be me standing there 30 years ago or 40 years ago, looking into an archive of my mother with all her files and files and files, because after my father died, our house turned into a sea of files. So in a way, I could even say now, after all these years, that File Room is actually my most personal work. It's my most biographical work. And perhaps, I'm just thinking aloud, because of that, there are people who are there, who come in, who are not there. There are impressions of people. There are many ghosts in the File Room for me. And so what could have been seen, or maybe some people see it as quite a sort of technical project where you go in and photograph these archives, is not at all like that. It's very personal to me, and I'm obsessed with it. We've done the book, we've done the museum, we've done all kinds of things with the archives work, but I can't stop photographing archives. I was just in Italy trying to get permission to go into the Vatican archive. It's just, I have to keep going back to these archives. What can I do? It's like what happens to archivists, archivists develop a very special character. They're very, very special people. And I think in spending so much time with them, I recognize the archivist in myself. And now I start to think, why do I call these my museums? Because actually they are archives with some display in them, built into them, like the Schaulager Museum where I just was in Basel. So perhaps the museums are not museums, but they are archives that also incorporate some display. And this, I must admit, the idea of these large museums, or we're going to now call them archives, developed in the archives that I was photographing. And interestingly, Rebecca, and I don't want to make any assumptions here, but most of the archives were manned by a woman. Someone had called a woman in and said, we've got this room full of files, organize it. And then what does she do? She calls the carpenter and says, these are the files and we need to make shelves. And they make the shelves, but the files don't fit. So they make a mezzanine and then they make another floor. And so it just builds very organically with wood and screws and the carpenter and the files. And in a way, that's exactly how I've built my museum bhavan. So I think if I hadn't worked in these archives, I don't think I would have imagined museum bhavan in the way that I did. And of course, there's this wonderful story about the lady at the Survey of India in Dehradun when I went to photograph her, and I thought she wouldn't give me permission. I asked if I could read something to her, and I took with me Saramago's All the Names, and I read to her the opening paragraph about the scent of the archive. And she said, it's okay, Dayanita, you don't need to tell me anything. I know you are building monuments of knowledge. And I thought, yeah, that is what one is doing. They are monuments of knowledge, these archives, that some woman has taken upon herself, to organize in the way that she knows best with the local carpenter. And that's what's so special about these archives, that there is human presence at so many different levels. No, this is not a server with data on it. The bundles in front of you on the right-hand side are from a Jain manuscripts archive in Ahmedabad. And, you know, somebody has bound them again and again and opened them, like the bundles we were seeing earlier and we'll see later. In every little piece of the archive, the human hand is there, the human presence is there. And so similarly, it's there and not there in the photographs.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and I think I love that parallel between the construction of the archive itself by a woman with, and there is this tension, and this is actually something we were getting at in the symposium earlier as well, this tension between the visual aspect of it, right, which is obviously so strong in your work. Your photographs are so impressively kind of tight and strong, but how do we manage that tension when this is one of the questions we had as a group, thinking about museums that might want to make their storerooms visible, that might want to open their storerooms to the public, or even projects that are underway to do this, and or projects that have been completed to do this. What does it mean to make these visible, to turn that space, which is often hidden from the public, into something that is more display oriented? And I think one of the answers to that question is actually, well, look at Dayanita's practice and the ways in which she's emulated the very structure of the archive in these museum constructions, right? Like this kind of parallel, I think, is so important in your work. And you and I also talked about, let me see if, we talked about the tactility of it, and you just mentioned the sort of unfolding, you know, the rolling back up, the unrolling, the wrapping. And I think there's something to preserve in the awesomeness of the archive. And one of the things I did want to get us to talk about a little bit more is this idea of monuments of knowledge, right? From that encounter in the archive that you just described. So for me, these photographs really do try to capture that monumentality. And I guess I wanted to get you to talk a little bit more about how you see these as monuments, as monumental. What does that mean to you in these photographs, in your encounters in the archives?
You know, I think when I photograph, I have a tendency to monumentalize whatever I'm photographing. Even if it's a person or a glass, I only photograph something if it becomes somehow monumental to me. I wish I could still photograph like I did in the 80s in the book Let's See, for example, that I just put together during COVID. I no longer have access to that eye. I can't take those casual photos in the middle of conversations. It's somehow it's a monumental thing that happens when I put my camera on the tripod and I get into what I call my photo mode. And this will probably sound crazy to many people, but I have to be called by that, by the glass or the bundle or the bicycle. it's not just my decision to take that picture. It's a collaboration between that object and me. And I have been to many archives where I haven't photographed. I've taken maybe 1 or 2 photographs to be polite. But I really want to feel that monumentality in what I'm looking at. I want to photograph it as though it was a monument and therefore worthy of being photographed. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks, but I have to think that. And that's why so many of my portraits look, like I love the person I'm photographing, and I can't photograph without it. I don't know how to photograph someone I don't like, and I'm sure I'll be in that situation, but I have to sort of love whatever it is I'm doing. And perhaps that then translates to a certain monumentality. Perhaps I'm just speaking aloud.
Yeah, and I think for me, it also, there's something about looking at these images, and I said this earlier, that they seem quiet at first. And then you start to realize, wait, what's in those bundles? What is that writing on the surface of the cloth? How do we understand all of the different files and records in there? And then for me, it's almost like my body starts to have to get bigger to understand the bigness of what's inside these archives. And I do think there is a kind of quiet, sneaky almost monumentality about just the pieces of information that are in there, that are pieces of people's lives, pieces that people felt worthy of writing down or needed to write down for various reasons, needed to gather into a bundle, needed to keep safe, and then adding that up over time. And as you said, the beautiful image of the archivist saying, oh, build these shelves, and then that's not enough. And so build these more shelves, push this wall out, right? That's what happens in Saramago's novel, is they have to keep pushing the wall out to add more, to add more shelves. And so this idea of, I truly do think that archives often are monumental, and they produce a certain mode of knowledge. But what's amazing about your photographs is that then, and not just the photographs, but the settings in which they exist, is that then we don't have access, right? It's not like we don't know what the knowledge is. We just know that there is potentially knowledge there. And I love that tension in your work as well.
Yes, I love that not knowing, Rebecca, that I didn't open any of the bundles. I never tried to find out. I loved the suspense of, the first archive I went into Delhi in the courts, I think, or I can't remember, but some government department. And they said, where do you live? Because I said, how can you find anything in this archive? It was almost like the one on the right. And they said, well, tell us where you live. And so I told them where I lived as a child. And they found a bundle, and in about half an hour, they came back and said, here's the bundle, and this is who your grandfather was, this is who your great-grandfather was. And they said, but before that, 2 generations before that, such and such, something happened, and then they said, but there was some conversions, and I really didn't want to go there. And I said, okay, I'm sorry, I take it back, I understand. But the idea that these archives are full of secrets and they could really change somebody's life. I don't know what I would have found had I gone further into my ancestral records. And I continue with that tension wherever I go. I never ask to see what those archives are about. On one hand, I'm just so fascinated by the architecture of the archives and the forms that have been developed all over this country, at least, for keeping the archives, whether it's a cloth bundle or it's palm leaves with thread around them, or it's papers rolled and kept like this on the shelves. So there's just that organizing. Then there's the organizing in the mind of the archivist. And it's not a single form that is followed everywhere, like in libraries. The archivist, depending on the material, has to come up with their own systems. And it's that thinking that I love, that how have they created the architecture for it? How have they catalogued it? And then what is their relationship with it? There's the famous story of an archivist in the External Affairs Ministry in Delhi from a while ago who became blind, and he could still find files because he had an assistant, and he could say on the third row, second shelf, pull out the third file, Yeah. That's a story that one hears. It may or may not be true, but it tells me something very special about the character of the people, but also the places and this whole world of the archives. Upstairs in my studio, I have these sliding walls with my books on them, and I keep adding them, and as I have more books, clearly something I have learned from the archives. And the joke with my friends is that I'll sort of die within my sliding walls, and they won't be able to find me because I'll have somehow locked myself into these walls. But I'm completely obsessed at a very, very fundamental level with the archive. I'm sure some psychologist will read all kinds of meanings into it, but that's where I am.
Yes, I think maybe for both of us on that one. So that leads me to, I wanted to talk also, we've talked about the human presence in the archive that is signaled in various ways. We've talked about the emptiness of it and the fullness of it in the sense of the human presence that are in the records themselves that are monumentalized and become give you a feeling of pressure when you're in the archive and when you're looking at your photographs of it. But I want to talk also about the other humans that are in your work, which are the users of your work, the viewers of your work, us, basically, and you, because you're also included in the sort of manipulation and using of your work. So whether it's encountering the work in these contexts where you have the folding kind of constructions in the gallery, or in a book that you can purchase, online and have in your home, that's not necessarily universally accessible, but at least more accessible than, say, a high art gallery print that not everybody can own. This is a format that you have used for years and years. And then this sense of the things like the poti box. Let's see, do I have another poti box image? There's privacy again. No. So the poti box, where you can own it and then kind of curate your own, going back here, hold on, where you can curate your own gallery show, right, in your home by changing the image every day. So I guess I wanted to push at, how you invite us to participate in this archive that you've created for us.
So there are two aspects to that. One is, photography to me is much more about dissemination than the image. The image is a starting point. And the dissemination in the gallery or even in the book or in the museum world is one kind of dissemination. But my generation, at least, has grown up with photography in shoeboxes. In my case, in fact, it was under every table surface with a glass on top. My mother would keep rearranging the photos. So it was a constantly changing archive, depending on who we wanted to forefront. So that's how my mother used photography. And then to go into a very sterile museum or gallery situation where photographs were fixed to the wall was difficult for me, because I wanted to be able to hold them, touch them, but also change them, because that's what's so great about photography. You put the big bundle, which is on the right, in the center, you change the meaning of both the photographs on either side. And I thought, I have to someday find a form that I can do that in these spaces and elsewhere. But as museums started to collect my work, and especially when the last of the museums, Museum of Chance, was acquired, I got really depressed because I thought, it's fantastic, of course, that museums have my work, but the reality is it lives in storage. And what are the chances, Rebecca, that you're going to be in New York at the time when MoMA is showing Museum of Chance? You can't even go to MoMA and request for them to pull out Museum of Chance, as you can at the Schaulager. So then what happens to my work? And what happens to you, the viewer? And in most cases, my friends. I want my friends to be able to handle my work and engage with it. So these boxes have worked very well in the idea of my taking my work, my archive, my exhibition into your house. And almost, you may not want to engage with the work, but now I've made such a tempting object that even if you say, I'll just leave it on the table, someone else will come and change it just because you can. And then once you've got into that, then you try to find out when I'm making the second box, because you can only buy one box at a time. And there are about 5 or 6 people in the world who have all 6 boxes that I've made so far, which means they have 30 times 30 times 30 times 30 times 30 combinations possible in curating the work. And so I've created this sort of parallel universe for my work away from publishing, from Steidl, and away from the gallery, and away from the museum, which is in your house. And believe me, that's such a privilege to have my artwork in your house. So that's one aspect of it. But equally, I do sometimes wonder what happens to these rising prices of work in the art world. And art becomes more and more inaccessible. And when my friends can't buy my work, and there's works of mine that I couldn't afford to buy, then what is going on? So it's great. Of course, everyone should make money and all that is fine. But photography is one of the art forms, or maybe the only one, that because of its reproduction, if that were to become the form, then one can slightly create perhaps another kind of market, another kind of clientele. And I feel with these boxes priced between 200 and 300 euros, I've been able to create that clientele for the work, where a young couple will go and buy the box like their first artwork. Can you imagine what that means to me? And then they find somebody who's in Sri Lanka, because that's the only place I'm showing this box 507. And so they have to make that effort to get the work, and then they have 2 boxes, and they have 30 times 30, 900 combinations. And then they find Pothi box in Baroda. Now they have 3 boxes. So my archive is also growing in your house without your even realizing it. Plus, I'm saying something, I'm nudging you to think about the value that we've created in the art world, and that perhaps photography has the possibility to work at another value. Does it have to follow in the value of all the other art forms? So that's sort of the subplot. I mean, what can I do, Rebecca? This is all I think about. So there's wheels within wheels within wheels.
Indeed, indeed. And just looking at the time, perhaps this is a good moment to turn it over to the audience for audience questions. I'm going to stop sharing, but we can always jump back onto to the images if we need. All right, so if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Or put a question in the chat. Yes, Claire.
I was straight in there. That was fantastic. Really engaging and funny, but also really inspiring, and yeah, fantastic to hear all these perspectives. I had a question about different national contexts for your work, Dayanita. It sounds like you've been doing work beyond Indian archives recently. Did I get that right? And kind of what your experiences were and thoughts were about kind of going global in your practice?
Well, it's not the same because, you know, it's all so well organized. It's beautiful, but it's too well organized. And so it doesn't have the same tension. And what I love about the archives is the human hand of that knot, you know. I have a work called Time Measures, which is really about the knotter and how every knot is different. So even if it were the same archivist knotting them all, they were in very different moods when they made those knots. And so I miss that. There's great architecture. For example, the State Archive in Venice is beautiful, 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 light. I think it's 20 miles of shelves with archives. It's incredible. It's just a labyrinth inside, but it's all very well ordered. And so it doesn't have that kind of tension, but I would still photograph it. I'm sure the Vatican archive is beautifully organized, but there's still something about the archive that I can't say no to, you know. I can say no to, like, okay, I don't make family portraits now, I don't do this now, I don't do that. But archive, it doesn't matter. I just have to get in there. There's also that smell of the archive. And I wonder if I and Rebecca, maybe you get a little addicted, you know? So like people are addicted to substances. Maybe I'm a little addicted to that scent and the humidity of the archive. Which, as we know, is not great for paper, but it's there. And then I work with a publisher. I'm going to show you something. I haven't planned this. So I work with the brilliant Gerhard Steidl, and I'm so glad I have this in this room. So he made this box called Paper Passion. And in it is a book. And when you open the book, there's a bottle. And guess what it's the smell of?
Oh, we need smell-o-vision.
Yes. The smell of old paper.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, totally.
So we are in some ways, you know, made for each other. I even call Steidl my book husband, or friends of mine call him my book husband. But, you know, that sort of sums it up. Like, who would make a perfume on the smell of old paper?
That's right.
So that was just an aside because I suddenly saw it.
No, that's absolutely right. I think there is something about obsession and engagement. I do think there's an addiction to that smell, to that feeling of being in the archive. And in fact, we have a question in the chat from Susan Bean, who's a South Asian art historian. You may know her work. She's, and she says, lovely to see us. Can you talk more, pull apart that feeling of monumentality that you must feel in order to want to photograph? And I think part of it is this sensorium, right? Of being surrounded by scent and files and papers and wanting to somehow capture that. But can you speak more about what it takes for you to kind of get there?
Had I known Susan was in the audience, I would have known she would have picked up on that, because it's very difficult to answer that question. I was coming to it as we were speaking. So let me try. For me to photograph, say, this perfume bottle, I have to feel a physical draw to it. It has to want to be photographed as much as I want to photograph. It's a conversation between the chair and me, between the bundle and me. And to do justice to that, I have to monumentalize it. I have to make it larger than life. I have to have that feeling for the person or the chair or the building. And that's what I'm calling monumentalizing. But maybe I didn't understand what you meant by monumentalizing. But for me, it's trying to create a monument out of this bottle. And if I had that photograph with me, I could show you a perfume bottle I photographed in a museum in Kerala, because it was the last perfume bottle of this political leader. And then because everything gets printed the same size, you lose sense of the scale of it. But more than that technicality, I think it's to do with the Hasselblad, the camera that I use, on the tripod at waist level, and the camera also has a certain monumentality, and you will face me very differently when I'm with the Hasselblad versus if I'm with any other camera. So it could have something to do with the square format, with the camera that I use, but all this is sort of pieced together to create a monument out of someone's spectacles even.
Yeah, and I feel like there's really, for me, the context into which you put your photographs, from the small, the accordion booklets inside the Museum Bafan and other book boxes, to the file room book, to the teak constructions, that they demand that you move your body in certain ways in relation to it.
Yes.
And whether it's sort of peering in and intimately unfolding those accordion booklets, it seems paradoxical, but I do think that because you're sort of, the work demands that you look closely, and because of that, you are asked to be surrounded by those photographs, by those images of archives, machines, whatever it happens to be, people. And so it does reinforce this idea of each photograph is its own mini monument. And then we have the whole archive becoming, of those photographs as they pile up, becoming a huge monument. So it becomes this kind of, you zoom in into the photograph, and then you zoom back out into the bigger space, or into the full book. So I do think there's something about that square format, and the Hasselblad, as you're saying, but I think it's also about the respect that your objects show for each individual photograph.
Yes. That is very important to me. In fact, Simrit Dugal, I think, has written about it, a certain distance. I'm never too close and I'm never too far. I worked out a certain distance from which, or a certain closeness from which I photograph. But the body is very interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up, because whether it's the box where you have to change the images or the museum that you have to physically, that's what I miss about photography on the wall, is that you don't engage with your body. Whereas for me, the making of the image, the making of a book, these are all very, very physical. And I forgot to wear my jacket. I should have worn that. And so now I even have a jacket with 9 pockets, into which I put my Museum Bhavan books, and I stand around at my own opening outside, as I was doing in Venice last month, and I become the vitrine and show the books to people, pulling these books out of my jacket. And I think I am by no means a performance person, by no means, but there is a performative aspect to both the making and the showing of photography that is, I think, very interesting to start talking about. Certainly is very important for me.
Yeah. And that actually segues perfectly into a question we got from the chat from Soham Joshi. who says, every time I see your work, it's always so inspiring to see the way you explore the identity of these book objects. This is the connection. Do you sometimes feel that you have, in a way, become one with your work? Like you have become an archive of the photographed archives, and you, in a way, take them with you as you continue your journey and explore the work further. Maybe like a book person, hyphenated, a book person of sorts, and the image of you at Venice with the accordion in front of you is sort of perfect for this, right? So,
and at the back of that jacket, which I should have worn today, is written "My Life as a Museum." So yes, Soham, I am completely one with my work now, and I wear that jacket. I was in Europe for a few weeks. I wear it every day. Even if it doesn't have books in it. I just like the idea that I'm wearing the architecture of my museums that is not connected to anybody else. I can walk into any church, any museum, anyone's house and pull out one of my books and have a little exhibition, you know? I love that autonomy as an artist, as for photography, that I can. Who knows about the art world? It's so fickle, no? You can be flavor of the month today and doesn't mean you will be the next day. And I can't base my life on that. So between the boxes and my jacket, I have the work with me. So, you know, by the time you call your security guards to say you can't have your exhibition inside the Vermeer exhibition, you know, I will have put it away. So I'm like, yeah, I'm making my own kind of little art world. And I'm very much part of it.
yes,
My
excellent.
body is part of it.
Yeah, well, and that's sort of also why I wanted to, like, I feel like you are also one of us in the sense that you are a viewer of and participant in the construction of this and inviting us to be a part of that too, right? So this is the potentiality I really truly see in your work. We have a hand raised and a question in the chat. So I'll, Sue, do you want to unmute?
Yes, hi. Hopefully, yeah. Hi, hello. Thanks so much. It's been so interesting to hear about your work, Dayanita. And when Rebecca spoke about your work a few weeks ago at the event, I was so fascinated to see, and I found your photographs really powerful and evocative. I'm an archivist myself. I work here at the university in the design archives, and I really loved that sort of human presence in your photographs, which I think isn't always there in ways that archives are depicted. And so this is more a comment really probably than a question, but if, you know, I'd love to hear any responses you might have. So, you know, the archive in your photographs is a space inhabited by real people who have just sort of left the space. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of it, because archives are often seen and discussed in these very sort of symbolic ways. And I'm always interested to see how archives appear in different contexts and how archivists appear, I guess, and perceptions and identities of archivists and how people identify with the practice of being an archivist and what that involves and what that means to people. Because for all the kind of theoretical discussions we can have about it, it's a very personal encounter that we have. And for me, that's a really beautiful aspect of your work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I can just say that, well, thank you very much. But I think at least the archivists that I have met are different from everybody else. They're just different. They have two lives. So they have the home life, and then there's the life of the archive. And then in the archive, sometimes they get obsessed by certain characters from the 17th century, and then the signature changes. And then, so they're living, and Avik Sen has written beautifully about one such encounter that we had in Calcutta with an archivist called Srila, and how she was obsessed with some character in the archive. And, you know, she's not an academic who's going to write a paper about it, but she's invaluable because she's the one who's creating the structure from which an academic will source their material. But then she also develops her own connection to the archive. And so she waits to pack her tiffin and get onto that train that'll bring her to the archive, because this is her world. The family life is another world. And so when we showed File Museum in Tokyo, I think, there was a wonderful feminist curator, and she said, where are the women? Because I had displayed in the File Museum pictures of the archives, but not of the people. They were in the storage inside. And I found, because she sort of challenged me, I found 15 portraits of women. And so out of the File Museum, because they have these boxes, we created another museum, and I called it the Women Archivists or something straight like that. So File Museum gave birth to a museum of archivists in Tokyo, which is what the museums are supposed to do, which again goes back to the archive, because an archive is alive. It's constantly birthing new thoughts, new ideas, and, so the idea of being able to create a shrine really for these women was very important to me. And someday I'll probably make a book out of that, out of the women, because it just so happened that all the archives were really put together by women, all the archives I'd been to.
I think that is the case. Yeah.
Really?
Thank you. Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I do too. I think there's something about the ethics of care and the kind of connection to sort of tending the past and memory that is perhaps gendered across a variety of different societies, particularly, both India and the UK, North America.
Mm-hmm. I should also say I was born to an archivist. We made a book of my mother's photographs, and we called it Noni Singh the Archivist, because my mother, everything has to be catalogued for her. She has files of my medical prescriptions, but she's also made an album of all the girlfriends' photos that she found in my father's rooms when she married him, and put all of them into an album, put her picture on the last page, and said, hey, some respect for photography at least. This is 1961. A young woman who, she used to photograph, but she didn't know anything about what it means to be a photographer or an archivist. But she just had this drive that everything, even if it was her husband's girlfriends, everything had to have an album. Everything had to be catalogued.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sue. So we have a question in the chat and then a couple of hands raised. So Kajal Meghani is asking about, and this is actually connected to what we were talking about earlier with the smell of the archive and really enjoying interacting with the archive and watching other people enjoy interacting with the archive. And Kajal was asking, how do you pick archives to photograph prior to visiting them? Do you know if you want to photograph them before you show up? So that's one question. And then the other question is there ever a tension when you get to the archives of wanting to photograph a disarray in the archives and the archivist sort of not wanting you to photograph that? And this sort of goes along with the narrative you just shared about being kind of challenged about what's not included in your, in your group of photos, but there can be a challenge in the archive, like, no, you can't go see that. You can't photograph that. You can't, I don't want this to be shown. Have you ever encountered that?
I haven't encountered it because I'm quite sensitive to it myself. In people, in archives, in homes, I have a pretty good sense of what's not okay. So no, I haven't had a situation where somebody's told me don't photograph it. But I've left out things that I know I shouldn't photograph. So in that sense, there's probably a lot of self-censoring that happens. And it's the same with people, homes. One just develops this sense. And I don't want to offend anybody. So no. And if there's a disarray, it's a sort of working disarray, like the image you were showing, And then the other question was, how do I decide? Well, one of the technical things is, as long as the archive has the same flooring. So once the archive is moved, and say it's gone to a museum or it's even gone to a new building, the thing I'm after goes, it disappears. So it's not just the archive that I'm after, it's the housing, the architecture. And so when the flooring changes, the archive changes. It's also the same for chairs. When I go to a museum to photograph a beautiful old chair, it's not the same. And I go into a house in Calcutta to photograph it, and it's present, it's monumental, it has a life, it's alive, it has opinions, it has personality, you know? And so there's some preparation I can do before, which is to find out if the architecture is the same. If it's moved, if it's an archive that's been moved, then I'm not so interested. And then once I get there, there's a certain, and I haven't been able to define exactly what it is, but there is a certain visceral gut connection that I have to feel from the archive. Is this archive calling out to me? Or is this archive just there? And so in that case, I take a few photographs because it's taken weeks or months to get permission, but I don't spend a lot of time in it. And I find I don't end up using those photographs. So there has to be this connection between me and what I'm photographing. And that's probably what, say, Sue picks up on when she says the photos are evocative to her, you know? It's because there's something else going on. I'm not just technically recording things. It has to be a conversation, even with spectacles or a bottle of perfume.
Excellent. Well, we have one hand raised in the, so Gurnor Singh, and maybe this will be our closing question because we're coming to the end of our time. But so Gurnor, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi. And actually, it's not a question, it's more like an observation that I found very interesting. Like it's interesting how you made work using archives, and now your own work is kept at an archive at the galleries, and somehow you found a way to keep them alive as an art, and you didn't want it as an archive, and like it's just interesting to think how in future people would interact to your work as an archive.
I'm quite aware of that. And somehow, even when now I think about what do I do with my work and, you know, do I make a trust? Do I just let it, what do I do with my work? The archive part, the research part is really important to me. And so I'm very happy, especially with the collectors of my boxes and the ones who have 5 or 6 of them, you know, and hopefully in my lifetime, I'll make another 15 or 20. So my archive could be in all those homes. And that then frees me from even worrying so much. I make so many books. I'm making 5 books which title this year. So in a sense, you could say that the archive is just building on its own, and I won't need to create an archive. And yes, most of my museums actually are archives. I think at that time I was a little critical of museums. I mean, I still am. And the work was made as a critique of the museums. And so I called it museums. But actually they're archives with a display, like the one behind me, you know. There are some photographs on display, but then there's a storage inside of about 100 photographs so that things can keep changing. So the idea of an archive being a living archive and have the possibility of display, like the Schaulager Museum in Basel. That's the best example in the art world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love this.
Thank you.
I love this idea of, oh, sorry, Gurnor.
No, it was really interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
That was a great question. And it made me realize that this question of living in the death and living, or the way in which your photographs of the archive show us how archives themselves are animated, are living. But I think you're also right to be suspicious or to be concerned about the death of an object when it goes into a museum store, when it goes into an archive, because there are archives where it is a little bit more deadening. And so I do think there's an interesting sort of dialogue or spectrum there, that where we move between the sort of animated and the less animated, and there is this kind of enlivening that your work brings us into the archive through. And I think that's really, really powerful. So yes, and then the fact that we all are holding your archive with us. This is also an excellent image to take with us. So, well, let me bring our conversation, at least this portion of our conversation, it will continue on when we look at your work and when we see you next. But thank you so much, Dayanita, for joining us, for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much. And thank you, Claire. Thank you for inviting me. And it's such a great privilege to talk to you, Rebecca. We have so much in common. We could talk for 24 hours nonstop.
I know, exactly. Exactly, but we will spare the group from
yes.
But yes, thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope this was helpful and interesting. Yes, lovely to see you all, and thank you, Dayanita.
Thank you. I didn't know if we had to wrap up anything. Maybe Rebecca's gone. Bye.